Okay, we've just surpassed the 130 mark of participants, so I think we should get going. So, good morning or good afternoon to all of you, depending on which part of the country you're joining us from. Bonjour ou bon après-midi à tous. Je m'appelle Martin Sampson. Je fais partie de l'équipe de l'Association canadienne des parcs et loisirs et je suis membre de la direction du projet Measuring Impact. My name is Martin Sampson. I'm on the team at the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association, and I'm a member of the executive of the Measuring Impact Project, which we at CPRA undertook with our partners at the Canadian Fitness and Lifestyle Research Institute, CFLRI. I'd like to welcome you to the Quantifying the Impact of Sport, Physical Activity and Recreation webinar, which will orient you to the Measuring Impact Project. Measuring-impact.ca is the website. Tons of useful tools and resources there, so I encourage you to visit. Before we get started, I wanted to offer a huge shout out to Christine Cameron at CFLRI and her team for all their work on this important project. It just wouldn't have happened without their brains and dedication over the last 18 months. Really delightful to work with Christine and her team, including the board of directors at CFLRI. You're going to be hearing from some of them shortly. I'd also like to thank our funders, including Parks Canada and the Canadian Training Network for Parks and Recreation, and of course SPARC, the Sport, Physical Activity and Recreation Committee. This project would not have been possible without their support. CPRA's mission is to champion the vital role that the recreation and park sector plays in Canadian life. We advocate for thoughtful public policies that yield vibrant, accessible public spaces, programs, and services which improve community health, vitality, and resilience. So, as many of you will know, in recent years, the prevalence of data-led decision-making has surged. This approach is really critical in our sector because it helps justify investments and demonstrates the tangible value and return on those investments through quantifiable measures and outcomes. So we're thrilled to have you join us as we delve into the social, health, economic, and environmental impacts of the sport, physical activity, and recreation sector. There are close to 400 people registered for this, so there's obviously great interest, and that's excellent. Please note that, excuse me, that this webinar is being recorded. The recording will be made available to all registrants after the session, and in fact, we'll be distributing it publicly. We also strongly encourage you to submit questions in the chat function, and we will get to them either as we go or we have some time reserved at the end. Si vous avez des questions en français, n'hésitez pas de les poser dans le chat. Nous les traduirons rapidement et poserons aux présenteurs qui répondront probablement en anglais. Okay, so feel free to pose questions in the language of your choice. We'll do our best to quickly translate them. The responses will likely be in English, and we can follow up en français as necessary. So I'd like to start by introducing our esteemed presenters for today's session. First, let me introduce you to Mike Roma. Mike's the immediate past president of CPRA, and he's been a leader in our sector for 20 years. He's an MBA from the University of Alberta, specializing in leisure and sport management, and has held numerous leadership positions in the recreation and parks sector, including as president of the Alberta Recreation and Parks Association, his home province. And second, I'd like to introduce Dr. John Spence from the University of Alberta and member of the board at CFLRI. Dr. Spence is a Canadian Academy of Health Sciences Fellow, and he's dedicated his career to promoting healthy active living and reducing risks for chronic disease by examining the factors that influence physical activity and sedentary behavior. I think he's one of the leading minds in Canada on this subject matter, so we're lucky to have them. Both of these gentlemen are on the executive leadership team of the Measuring Impact Project, and you know, they're leading minds that are examining these things, so I think we're lucky to have them. I'm certainly lucky to have them as mentors and guides on this really important subject matter. And I'm going to hand it over to them in a moment, but before I do, I want to once again thank all of you for being here. We have a lot of people registered for this, and that I think demonstrates that our sector is really hungry for this information. So without further ado, let's get started with our first presenter. Mike, over to you.
Thanks, Martin, and hi, everybody. As Martin said, thanks for joining us and giving us an opportunity to tell you about the work we've been doing over the last 12 to 18 months. We're very excited about it and hope you are too. If you go to the next slide, please. It just sort of kind of explains what Martin has already said. We all know about the value that physical activity, sport, recreation have in our communities, in our provinces and territories, and across Canada. We know about it. Many decision makers know about it. Many members of the general public know about it, but it still has traditionally been very hard to quantify. And that is important because when the sector, when SPAR competes with other interests for political affection or budget or what have you, some of those other sectors do maybe tell a bit better of a job of the impact, the quantifiable impact that they're making. So despite the knowledge that we all have about these benefits to individuals and to communities, CPRA and CFLRI set out to try to help everybody quantify those impacts in a consistent, a robust, and a kind of rigorous or defendable way. So we set out on that journey about, like I said, 12 to 18 months ago. It might even be beyond 18 months when we first started talking about it. And if you go to the next slide, it shows you I guess the primary contributors to that conversation initially and along the way. So the project was led by CPRA and CFLRI. We also had help. We had lots of help along the way. One source of help that we had was an expert advisory group that met, I think, 3 times throughout the process. It was comprised of people from across Canada that have interest or experience in quantifying impact of hard to quantify things, as well as obviously specific interest in SPAR, sport, physical activity, and recreation. We had a consulting company based out of Quebec, Raymond Chabot Grant Thornton, that was hired to help us and give us kind of technical expertise along the way. And obviously the project was led by the executive team, which you see up on the screen right now. I know Martin already did this, but I do want to thank our supporters for the project. So that's SPARC, which is a Sport, Physical Activity and Recreation Council, which is a group that represents federal, provincial, and territorial administration, if you will, related to sport, physical activity, and recreation. The Canadian Training Network for Parks and Recreation, which oversees the CPSI Playground Safety Program, and Parks Canada. I'm going to pass it over to John to tell you a bit about, I guess, our findings, and then I have some more exciting news to share with you after that. So go ahead, John.
Thanks, Mike. And let's move to the next slide, please. So as Martin mentioned at the beginning, and you may have seen in your invitation, or you may already have been to the website, there's an extensive a report that's a fairly extensive document that will summarize in much more detail than I'm going to speak to today. And I encourage you all to look at that report. So I'm just going to describe a little bit of the process and some of the findings from our project, and emphasize, touch upon, again, sort of the procedures that we employed. So first of all, we focused on, and I should step back and say, this process is quite unique. And why it was unique was because of, and Mike alluded to this, the fact that we are representing across what we're calling the SPAR sector, so sport, physical activity, and recreation. There have been economic analyses done in Canada and internationally that have perhaps focused on one part of SPAR, primarily physical activity, and primarily focusing on the health benefits associated with physical activity, or the economic the sort of healthcare costs associated with physical inactivity, or perhaps maybe looking at sport impacts. And maybe there have been assessments of the recreation sector, but as far as we are aware, this is the first time that there's been an attempt to summarize across the quote unquote SPAR sector. And we think this is important because oftentimes we are trying to speak to some of the same decision makers, practitioners, governments, and so forth. And there's no question there's massive overlap between the interests of, for instance, community sport and recreation and physical activity. So that's my preface. I've been involved in other economic assessments, specifically on physical activity and primarily around health outcomes, for instance, with the Conference Board of Canada back in the 2010s era. Okay, so quickly now on the process. So we focused on 4 main impact categories, and that was health, social domain, economic, and environmental. I'll speak to those a little bit more in a second here. The process that we employed is we first attempted to identify a range of potential indicators. So what are going to be the important variables, for instance, that we want to look at within each of health, social, economic, and environmental? And we did this a couple of ways. One was looking through the literature, any previous reports and so forth that have been done. Also, we consulted with that research advisory group, expert advisory group that Mike mentioned before. And there was a range of people on there, academics, decision makers, practitioners, people who are very experienced in the various aspects of the SPAR sector. And that helped us to be able to identify these indicators, which is, again, I'll speak to in a second. We employed a very rigorous process. And the key thing to think about or understand here is to be able to do this type of assessment, we need 2 key things. First of all, we need to be able to identify what are the, we need to be able to monetize any of the either benefits, outcomes related to SPAR. So to be able to monetize them, first of all, we need to know, let's say, for instance, if we're talking about physical activity and health, we need to know what the levels of physical activity are in the country. And then we need to know what the cost is associated with either physical inactivity or physical activity as it relates to these various, let's say, health indicators. So again, for example, there are relationships between physical inactivity and risk for breast cancer. And there is somewhere out in the world where it's been documented what the association is between those 2 things. So we sort of multiply that risk factor by a dollar figure. So we need that monetized data to be, or information to be available, and that's usually available in the research literature. So our review is going to be limited by the data that has the research that's been done to show us what those monetary values are for any one of the particular indicators. So you might be sitting here as I report on the findings and say, oh, why didn't they include blah, blah in here? Well, we didn't include blah, blah because there may not have been any data or research findings to tell us what the actual monetization would be for that particular indicator. All right, so I'll stop with that. And then in some instances, we went and collected more data to be able to inform some of our decisions here. All right, so let's move on to the next slide. So here's a description, or here's a summary of the indicators. So we initially started with a list of 77 potential indicators. So within those 4 subgroups of environment, economic, social, and health, and 29 were removed, and that could have been for a whole host of reasons, whether that oftentimes it was going to be whether the data was available or whether that that monetized piece was available, and or also whether it was deemed to be important or relevant by our expert group. So what that ultimately ended up being was we ended up with 22 indicators in environment, 42 under economic, 8 under social, and 4 under health. And examples in here will be things like, for instance, under health, we'd be looking at healthcare costs associated with chronic diseases that we know, again, are associated with primarily physical inactivity, mental health benefits related to, again, oftentimes, well, engagement in SPAR. And yes, other estimates related to various diseases and chronic diseases. Under social, we were looking at things like volunteerism. So what is the economic sort of benefits around, or what are the contributions of volunteerism to the economy? Community and individual benefits, also crime and safety is another example. Under environment, we were looking at things like air pollution. So what are the costs associated with either reducing air pollution, greenness, availability of facilities, active travel, the benefits of active travel. And then one of the main ones was renewal of infrastructure, primarily, sort of your sport, recreation infrastructure. Under the economy, we're looking at things like SPAR's contribution to GDP, employment, retail sales, tourism, government investment. So anyway, that's giving you a sense of what all would have been included under these indicators. Okay, can we move to the next slide, please? So our sources of data here were things like government sources. Oftentimes, we'd be using reports like StatsCan reports. These would be on participation in sport, physical activity, or things like sales data. Was a key one, obviously, under the economy and the environment pieces, Public Health Agency of Canada, and so forth. We needed those research articles primarily to tell us about the associations between engaging in SPAR and the whole host of indicators that I've talked about here. We had organizational data, so from municipalities or sport organizations, and a lot of that data came from organizations such as the Canadian Fitness Lifestyle Research Institute, CFLRI. And then we looked at survey data of Canadians that might be different from what we would have received from StatsCan. So again, to emphasize that we were looking at what we would consider quote unquote credible sources, and we were employing as rigorous a process as we could throughout. Okay, next slide. So this is the bottom line from our project. So basically, we found within the social impacts a value of $14 billion, under health impacts $4 billion, under economic impacts $37 billion, and environmental impact $43 billion. And some examples of what would have contributed to these summary values. For instance, under social impacts, and something that really stood out to me was the value attributed to, or the contributions of volunteerism to the SPAR sector is substantial. And really accounted for much of what we identified under social impacts. Under health impacts, one example under there is we looked at, as I mentioned before, what the costs would be associated with physical inactivity, or if we reverse it, if we were to increase get the Canadian population to be more physically active, what would be the contributions to the healthcare system? And one example there would be if we saw an increase of 10 percentage points in physical activity, that we would see a reduction in healthcare costs around $630 million. In the environment area, a couple of interesting ones would be things like increasing active transportation we would see, like, by a 1% increase in active transportation, we could achieve a savings of about $564 million per year, and that would be in things like reducing air pollution and also perhaps benefits to the healthcare system. One of the substantial things under the environmental impact was the replacement of facilities, which accounted for a huge proportion of the environmental impact. And then finally, under the economy, we see that tourism contributes about $7 billion to the Canadian economy and to the GDP, and that, to tourism contributes about $7 billion overall. And we see a breakdown in terms of GDP of about $9 billion around recreation and $7 billion for sport. So these are substantial contributions within the SPAR sector. Okay, next slide, please. Now, going back to some of the points I made before about the process we employed, the kinds of data that we needed, our sort of rigorous approach that we employed, we know that it's very likely that these figures are conservative and that they're an underestimate of the true impact. And that could be because we just didn't have the data. We don't have that monetary conversion factor that we to be able to make that actual sort of dollar figure estimate. As I mentioned also before, we think that this report has achieved massive breadth in terms of what we're speaking to. We're going well beyond what would traditionally be focusing on physical activity and health and healthcare implications. And as I said, this we think is going to be a very useful tool for being able to advocate for the importance of the work, whether we're doing at a community level or provincially or even nationally. You'll see the abbreviation in here, the acronym SHE, that's the Measuring Impact report. So anyway, I think that I'll now say next slide, and I'll turn it back over to Mike here.
Thanks, Dr. Spence. And I just have to say that it's exciting to see everybody's names and positions and where they're from popping up on the screen here. And this is very much in line with what this slide is about, and it's about knowledge mobilization. So we're at a point right now where we have a product, we have a storyline for Canada as a whole as to what the impacts of SPAR are. And obviously we welcome you to go to the website to read the report. If you can make it all the way through, it's pretty extensive, but there's also infographics there. There's summary documents and summary statements that you can latch onto and use. And we do plan to kind of release new aspects of information and data throughout the course of the next quarter or two. The other thing that we're going to be doing, though, is when we kind of came up with the idea or took the initiative to develop this report and the storyline, we knew that it would be a snapshot in time, and it would be something that is going to require revisiting from time to time. Hopefully, more data becomes available, more information becomes available, and we do plan to revisit it and create kind of a living storyline that will change and evolve over time. And as I think Dr. Spence mentioned, and this is a key statement to make and to take away from this presentation, is that we think the numbers are quite conservative, and that storyline and that those punchlines with the numbers with the B behind it will ultimately go up over time. So the information is available, it's transparent, you can understand how those numbers were calculated, why certain indicators weren't able to be used, and really become familiar with measuring impact. But in another way that we wanted to help put that knowledge out there and help the sector was to be able to build off of that methodology that was used to calculate the story at a national level and enable, I guess, all of you at a community level or even at a provincial or territorial level to be able to tell a story about your jurisdiction. So on the next slide, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a calculator tool. We might still come up with a different name for it, but right now we're calling it a calculator tool. It's been developed. It's currently being kind of translated into a web-based format. So it'll be accessible for all of you and myself, Dr. Spence, Martin, Emma, everybody to use at your leisure. And it's going to include two different sort of types. One is going to be focused on a departmental impact. So if you're here representing a community and a budget, if you will, or a department in a municipality, it'll help you tell the impact story about that department every year on an annual basis. And then the other type would be a project-based value or impact story, which means if you have a major capital project, a new park, a new facility, a reinvestment in a facility, you'll be able to use the same methodology, the same indicators in a consistent way. Again, across Canada, we'll all be doing it in the same way to be able to talk about the impact that that project will have in your community and in your province, territory, and in Canada. So this is kind of a heads up for everybody to obviously, if you're going to use either one of those calculators, and hopefully you do, that's obviously why we're putting them together and putting them out there. You're going to need to know some characteristics of either your department or the project that you're proposing. So some of those inputs are going to be what you see up on the screen. We're going to need you to know what your operational budgets are, likely by amenity. So, by arena, by pool, by ball diamonds, that kind of thing. If it's a project, you're going to need to know your capital budget. You're going to need to know the amount of users that will participate either in your departmental programs, kind of holistically, the amount of participation that your department generates, or by a project, as well as the volunteer activity that surrounds the activities of your department or the expected volunteer activity that would be generated by your project. Special events and participation in those events is obviously something that you may have already, tried to quantify and use to tell that impact story. The same, you'll need to know that for both these calculators. And then we've actually also included tree cover. So if you have a way to understand the tree cover of your department in your community and what it looks like across your community, then you'll be able to embellish this value story a little bit more. You won't need each one of these, you won't need all of them together. It's just that if you can't come up with one or two of them, then obviously the ability for the calculator to spit out that higher value is diminished. So if you have all of them, that's great. If you don't, you'll still be able to use the tool and tell a story about your department or project. So the next slide shows an example. So we made up this fictitious project in BC, and I saw some architects from BC sign in, so they're probably wondering where this is, and they'll call me up after the webinar here. But if we just said there's a $160 million capital project that is an indoor pool in BC, and we assume that it would be $1.5 million a year operating cost, 20,000 annual users, not visitors, but users. So not visits or swim visits, but the amount of people, different people that will use the facility, that it would generate 1,500 volunteer hours in possibly event hosting, or some of the user groups that organize themselves to provide programs in that pool. And that facility is estimated or expected to host 4 provincial, national, or international events. So if we use those fictitious numbers, then the next, if you just click ahead, this is the kind of story that it would help you tell. So it would talk about the health impact or the economic burden that's averted, talk about the GDP impact associated with construction. So that's a one-time impact, and the jobs associated with that construction, one-time impact. It would talk about the annual impact to GDP, so a recurring year over year, as well as the job impact annually. It would outline the value associated with volunteering, and it would outline the value associated with tourism. So I think when you see that, it helps to many of you anyways, maybe not everybody, but it helps you to understand how this might kind of align with some of the stories that you've already told about your department or potential projects. I think what's important here is that it builds upon the methodologies or the data that you probably use to tell that story already. But what this kind of initiative does is it enables consistency across Canada, across regions, across provinces and territories. And hopefully it builds even more credibility behind those storylines than you might have had standing up in front of council with the help of a consultant, or maybe with the help of some of your staff to generate those storylines. So that, I think, gives you an idea of what the overarching story is for Canada. It gives you an idea of how we've tried to, or will continue to try to make this practical and usable at a community level or at a provincial and territorial level as well. And right now you should see that those calculators available to you this calendar year, and maybe even sooner than the end of the year. And I guess you also have the assurance that this group is not done with this initiative necessarily, and some of our funding partners aren't necessarily done. That we realize this is going to get better as we move forward, and we do hope that some of the data gaps, I guess, that we've discovered this time around that maybe didn't even exist other times these types of stories have been told, that they are filled, and if not, maybe we might even try to fill them through our own initiative. So I'm going to pass it back over to Martin to talk a little bit more about CPRA and moving forward, but I just want to thank everybody for signing on and hearing us out.
That's great, Mike. Thank you so much, and thank you to you as well, John. Great presentation. I think what we're going to do is we're going to move now to the Q&A format, and I would encourage everybody to pose your questions in the Q&A chat below. You'll see there's a chat. You've all been adding your names. By the way, we have wonderful participation from right across the country. We're hovering right around the 190 mark, so that's great, but that's in the chat. There's a Q&A function. We currently have 4 questions there, so I'm going to pose those to the panelists. And I think, Emma, we could probably take the deck down at the moment. We'll come back to it when we do the wrap up. So I think right now I should be spotlighted, and I will look at the first question here. So Eliana McDonald asks, how would you advise to count users for amenities, e.g. in a playground? So how are we counting the users of some of the amenities?
I can take a first shot at that. I would say that some of these inputs will have to be estimated. We're going to provide guides on how we'd recommend you come up with those estimates or make those assumptions. But at the end of the day, you are going to have to come up with those estimates on your own and feed them into the calculator. So we'll try to provide that guidance. I know from my experience in my day job, there are different ways that you can go about getting user data or participant data for those hard to measure places. Head counts. You can also use mobility data to do that. So data generated from mobile devices. But there is going to be some homework, I guess, that you'll have to do to use the calculator. And it'll be primarily, I think the most onerous pieces will be estimating usership in those spontaneous or drop-in areas, and also carving up your operating budgets in a way that routes expenses and revenues back to certain amenities. So back to, if you have a multi-purpose facility, with arenas and pools and gymnasiums in it, being able to tell an operational budget story about each one of those different amenities within the building, which will require some assumption-based calculation. But we're going to try our best to give you some guidance on that, but there will be some work that you'll have to do at the community level or at the project level to kind of feed the calculator.
Thanks, Mike. Just before we move on to the next question, also probably worth noting, and this could be the subject of a whole nother webinar, but at CPRA we also have the Sport Physical Activity and Recreation database, and there's movement data available there. If you want to learn more about that, this may help, at least in part, with the question that you are posing. I think that one was answered. Oh, yes. The question you were posing, Eliana. So go to cpra.ca. CPRA.ca, and you can see the links to the database. Okay, next question comes from Lisa Renders. Do you see a similarity to the work that Social Value Canada does to measure impact, measuring SORI and support to achieve 2030 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals?
So I'll take a stab at that. I would see some overlap. The big difference between SORI and the SORI approach would be around what I'll call those softer variables. So those variables where they're harder to get those that monetization estimates. So SORI uses some sort of a financial proxy. Let's say, for instance, if we say that participation in sports on a regular basis results in increased self-esteem for children, can we monetize that? And with SORI, they may have a financial proxy, so that monetization piece, they may have a financial proxy for that, whereas we wouldn't employ that financial proxy. We're taking a bit of a different process there. We're looking for different type of data out in the literature for it. So yes, there'd be an overlap in some places, for instance, around some of our individual level social data that we had would be similar to what would be picked up in an SORI analysis. But there would definitely be places where SORI would have either have an estimate and we wouldn't have had, or they would have a different one than us because of the various financial proxies they would employ. And then the question around the SDGs, that's a good one. CFLRI has definitely done quite a lot of work around, and there's discussion in the sort of SPAR sector of trying to coordinate our approaches on addressing the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, Canada's stated plan for addressing the goals, and the various SPAR strategies. We have 4 main SPAR strategies now, including the active transportation strategy, along with all sorts of provincial ones. And it would make sense to us to be trying to coordinate in terms of addressing the SDGs and SPAR on things like active transportation, sustainable environments, and so forth. So some of what we've done in here would definitely relate to addressing the SDGs, but I wouldn't say that it was explicit in here.
Great, thanks, John. We're going to go to our next question. That's from Elaine Shelton. When you are calculating health impact, wouldn't it be important to consider number of visits versus number of users? Which of our panelists wants to have a go at that one?
Well, Mike, I think we both in terms of at the calculator level, we had a good discussion on this. We did a presentation at BCRPA, so in Penticton about a month ago. And yeah, it's whether it's the individual or the number of visits that's important. And Mike, refresh my memory if the distinction on the user versus the number of visits. Yes, if it's the health benefit, we're wanting to know at a population level what the impact is. So we want to know the number of individual users as opposed to if one individual is swimming every day and that counts for 7 users per week. So Mike, refresh my memory on that.
Yeah, it is. We definitely, I mean, you can go either way on it, and the most conservative might not be the right way, but the most assured indicator was that we landed on was to use the number of users and not the number of visits. Especially from a project specific, if you think about the impact that, say, an additional arena might have in your community, we decided that the new user that would be generated from that project would be a better indicator of impact than just somebody that's participating more, that they were going to get more of an impact if they went from not participating to participating again. So there will be instructions again for the calculator, and there's an explanation in the report about why some of the inputs were chosen the way they were. There is also the fact that when John was mentioning the blah blah in his presentation, sometimes the blah blah relates to a new distinct user as opposed to additional visits or additional hours of activity and that type of thing. So it wasn't, there was a variety of reasons why we chose the way we did. And hopefully that's explained in the background literature. And if it's not, I'm sure anybody on the executive team would be able to try to answer it in a more fulsome way than John and I just did.
And also, Mike, I think, it might be more practical if all you're doing is, if it's a turnstile and telling you that you had X number of visits that day, that might be the easiest thing for a facility to be able to monitor as opposed to that new user. So that's obviously a consideration for us, and we'd like to be able to really tap into both. It's what's feasible and sort of practical too. Will be a consideration for sure. Yeah.
Okay, great. So next question comes from Todd Reichart. Todd asks, how would you incorporate future changes in users, i.e. change in demographics over the next 10 years? This would affect the GDP forecast.
Yeah, so I mean, and Chris Cameron is probably the real technical expert here. So Chris, anytime you want to chime in, go ahead, but I'll try answering that one as well. So we aren't generating any of the source data here. We're just finding it, and then we're finding ways to monetize the benefit data or the outcome data that exists. So inherent with that means that as that source data gets updated, and we tried to find all data that was, on some kind of cycle so that it does get updated over time. As it gets updated, we will grab the new kind of indicator and apply the new value or monetization to it, and it will change the output of our storyline in Canada, and it'll obviously change the output of the calculator as well. So we are kind of hoping or trusting that source data gets updated, and when it does get updated, again, we would trust in it that it would be accommodating for any kind of societal changes, demographics or other that might have happened throughout the course of between now and when it gets updated, and how that also might sort of translate into the future impacts that are expected. So it's a good question for sure. And I think as the inputs change, the storyline will change. It's just that right now, we're not responsible for any of those inputs other than a survey that we commissioned as part of this project. And that survey is referenced throughout the report, which you'll see, and it gives a lot of good narrative around the numbers, but doesn't directly really pertain to any of the numbers. Most of the impacts are pulled from other credible sources, like Dr. Spence explained in his presentation.
You actually did a good job there, Mike.
Excellent, excellent. We had a couple of questions here about CPRA's Canadian Parks, Recreation and Sport Infrastructure Database and whether or not the data within measuring impact is going to be linked to the database. Currently, it is not, but we are in discussion right now with Active Exchange, and in fact, I have to probably bring up my colleagues on the executive team for the Measuring Impact project up to speed on this, but there are some possibilities that we are looking at. So I'm not going to dive into those questions. I do encourage everybody to look into the Canadian Parks, Recreation and Sport Infrastructure Database, create an account on it, start updating your infrastructure. That gives you access to a whole bunch of things that are free and useful. And yes, we are continuing a discussion about how do we integrate these two really important tools or initiatives that we're part of here at CPRA. So I will move to the next question, I think from Andrea Redmond, which is the calculator tool able to measure impact without inclusion of built amenities? For instance, programming taking place online as a virtual class. So to restate the question while you collect your thought, is the calculator tool able to measure impact without inclusion of built amenities? For instance, programming taking place online as a virtual class.
The short answer to that is yes. And the reason is that some of those inputs that we talked about, or that I went through for the calculator, being operational budget or usership or volunteer hours, as long as you can, explain that program or initiative with some of those indicators, then it will give you an output for whatever the input is. So I'm not sure, it's great to hear these questions and to understand them, especially now that we're working on that interface that ultimately you'll use to access it. So it just, it's another note to take on what that interface needs to look like and the wording of it and so on. But the answer is, if any program or initiative or facility or departmental, kind of overview you can attribute some of those inputs to it, then the calculator will spit out an output.
That's great, Mike. We have a few more minutes for questions left. I have 4 or 5 in the queue right now. I think we have about 8 or 9 minutes. So if you have a question, please pose it. We'll do our best to get to it. Next question comes from Heather Cowie out in Alberta, I think. Great friend to CPRA and a long-time professional in this sector. Heather starts with a thank you. Thank you for this work. As this data is now open source, as this data is now open source, are we able to use it provincially? And if so, how shall we loop back what we are doing to this team? So we want to use the data. We want to share with you how it's being received. How do we loop back? I could probably take a crack at answering that, Mike, and then John, if you have an additional question. So first of all, great, please do use it. And this is a conversation that we're having together as a sector. So any insight you have in using the data, you can communicate it directly to us either at CPRA or at CFLRI. Probably best to send it to info@CPRA, and then it'll be appropriately triaged and sent to the right person. But we definitely want to hear from you. We'll also be talking in a minute a little bit about CPRA Connect and some other fora in which you can communicate with each other as a sector, and which you can communicate with us. So I'll leave that for now, but definitely write to us directly, Heather. And yes, please do use it. It is open source and it is available for your use in your jurisdiction to advance our sector. Okay, I'm going to move on to a question from Elaine Shelton. Does one individual using a ski hill have the same value as one individual using a trail?
And make sure we don't miss the tree canopy question, Martin,
Yep.
also.
I'm going to come back to it. It's just that Todd has posed, that's his second question. So we'll definitely come back to it for sure.
I can answer this one, and it seems like John's ready to do the tree one, so I wasn't hoping to answer that one anyway. But unfortunately, I would say, and before I answer this, I'll just say that we know this isn't perfect. We know it's an underestimate. We know it's not perfect. We know that even with the story that we're telling right now, it doesn't have, on the health side, as an example, they don't have the indicators that they had 10 years ago to tell this story. So we know that, we're at the mercy of what's available in terms of information and data and impact in order for us to be able to use that and have an output. So right now, it doesn't differentiate between different types of activities. And I know intuitively you'd say, well, somebody that uses a trail versus somebody that's using an athletic track, they're getting different levels of physical activity. They're probably doing it for longer, blah, blah, blah. And you're right. But the issue is we don't in Canada have a data set that says participation in downhill skiing leads to this specific health outcome or this specific social outcome. We've got some research that says physical activity in general leads to those types of outcomes, but we don't have anything specific by sport, by activity, on either the outcome side or the valuation side. So that's an example of how we hope the evolution of this story, how we all together will work to create an even better and more accurate story moving forward. One of the ways that we'll do that is to have activity specific, or maybe even like hourly indicators for the amount of activity, not just activity happening, yes or no, binary, but the amount of activity and the type of activity. It definitely, that granularity does exist in some other jurisdictions where either an impact or a social value story is being told, but we're not there yet in Canada in terms of the source data, and therefore there are some, call it some intuitive limitations with the model right now. That being said, I still want to encourage everybody to get behind this and use it, because it's better than anything else that we have available to us right now. And there is a commitment, I think, in general, for not just our executive team and the groups that have been involved in this project to date, but just in general, the sector, to build upon this and make the story better, make the source data better. You can see some of the questions that are being posed here are about how can we even track participation better. I think all of that, as we do better in the sector at gathering data, those other pieces to the puzzle, like impact per type of activity or hours of activity, will definitely come into place and make this type of a model even stronger.
Yeah, I'll just add to that yeah, Mike's right. This is a fairly blunt instrument, and it's not just in Canada that we'd be limited on that input side, because the what the research shows in terms of that linkage between physical activity, let's say, and those healthcare costs, the one distinction you could maybe make would be on intensity, but absent of making the distinction between your downhill skier or that trail walker, it would be we just can't get to that level right now based on the economic outcome data.
Okay, folks, we have a couple of minutes. We scheduled this webinar for 90 minutes, so it's probably in your calendar for 90 minutes. Our hope was always to get it wrapped up at about the 1 hour mark, but we're going to do our best to get through the next couple of questions here, and then we'll wrap things up. So let's do the tree canopy thing. So Todd asks, how does the canopy measure affect the overall result? There's no indication of this in the example provided.
Well, Mike was the tree guy, so I don't know why he was throwing it back to me, but my understanding it's canopy, and I believe it's municipal canopy. Mike?
That's, to the best of my knowledge, the right answer.
Okay, we'll leave it at that. Linda asks a question. John, you referenced the four SPAR strategies. She's asking where she can find them. So, I mean, if you have them at your fingertips, we can share them here in the chat. If not, Linda, what you can do is write to info@cpra.ca and we'll send you links to all of them. But John's come off mute, so he has them probably.
Well, there's the framework for recreation, which CPRA, I'm assuming, would have links to and so forth. So the first thing is there's four strategies: one in the recreation area, one in the sport area, one around physical activity, and one around more specifically active transportation. The sport one is the sport strategy, the sport policy, sorry, and that's currently under review, and it's relatively imminent. Supposedly it's released, but it might not be until the end of the year. So the current one is 2012. Then the recreation framework is 2015, I believe. And then we have the Common Vision, which is available from Public Health Agency of Canada, which is the physical activity strategy. And then if you enter Active Transportation Strategy Canada, you'll find the National Active Transportation Strategy. And then, as I said, all sorts of provincial strategies and plans.
That's great, John. And just a quick update on the framework, or an update on the framework update. So we are in the process of publishing an update to the original 2015 framework, which will be live on the CPRA site in the next couple of weeks. But we have also now started the process of renewing the framework. Much more to come on that in the fall, but we'll be managing a consultation process over the next sort of 6-8 months. And you will, all sector representatives will be made aware of this, and we'll be sending a number of ways that you can contribute to the development of the renewed framework. So keep your eye on the CPRA website for the framework update. And then keep your eye on CPRA's website and our social media channels as we start the consultation phase for the big renewal, and that's coming shortly. Okay, great. Dave Mayer asks, do you have any questions for how municipalities can better track participation usage? For example, visitor counters or info track from admissions or memberships?
I can try to answer this because my day job is as a consultant, so I'm always asking for this, and I'm always charged with trying to not fabricate, but trying to come up with it if it doesn't exist. So there isn't an ideal way. I think I mentioned mobility data. I saw someone put a comment in the chat box that the mobility data that's available through the database isn't the right kind of data, and you're right, it isn't. It's not meant to help understand absolute participation in a certain area, that kind of mobility data, but there is mobility data that you can get, costs money, but you can get that can help you do that. There's also ways to try to measure that from, like I said before, having head counts, maybe having turnstiles for certain types of amenity spaces, registration software, surveys, exit surveys, intercept surveys. There is no easy way to do it. And I think that's why, as a sector, we've done a pretty poor job of gathering usage data up until this point, and probably I'd say continued to do a poor job, not because of lack of trying, just because it's hard to do. And there isn't a standardized sort of accepted way to do it. So I think it's multifaceted. From my opinion, it has to be multifaceted. It has to include a variety of those things I mentioned, maybe some others that you or others on the webinar have employed in the past, and the recognition that it's never going to be 100% accurate. And these inputs to the model don't have to be 100% accurate necessarily. They just have to be informed by the right people. And you are probably, the people on this call would comprise probably the right people, the most educated people or informed people to make those assumptions. So don't be afraid to make those assumptions. Just make sure that you don't, make sure they're as realistic as possible or as defendable as possible. Because if the input is not defendable, If the number you're using is not defendable, then it'll call into question what the output is too.
Okay, great, Mike. Thank you. We have 2 questions left, so we're going to have, I think, gotten to almost all of them, or maybe a third. So let's get through these 3, and then we'll close the questions off. How much, this is from an anonymous attendee, how much does the value of the SPAR sector change if sport is removed from the data?
I don't like being the only one talking here, Dr. Spence. So do you want to take a shot at that one?
I think that's, and this would be one where Chris could chime in on. I don't know if it's that easy to articulate or disaggregate. So Chris, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, if you were to take sport completely out of here.
Well, we do try to look at that in the report. In fact, we separate it between sport and what the industry is defined as an active recreation industry code. So we do try to differentiate that throughout the report. So you'd often see values related to sport, and you'll see those related to active recreation. Now, it's really hard to separate them because it is a blur of activities. You know, what's considered active recreation could also be considered a sport. So we've done our best based on data specific that defines it as sport and active recreation. But really it's a bit of a blur over the two. So if you take a look through the report that I think Martin had provided in the chat, you'll see the best that we are able to do in terms of the economic impact. And then you'll also see it throughout with respect to the environmental impact, because we differentiate those related to active transportation from those related to spectator sports, for example.
But on something like volunteering, for instance, it's probably a lot of sport related, but at a community level. So are we calling that sport? Are we calling that recreation? So that would be a place where I would think it would start to get real fuzzy. Would you agree, Chris?
Yeah, it's actually volunteering for sport, physical activity, and recreation. So definitely a blur.
Yeah.
Okay, 2 final questions, and then we will wrap things up. The penultimate question comes from Karina Whittington. Have you included any assumptions for attribution? How much of the outcome was caused by the activity, or counterfactuals? How much of outcome would have happened anyway?
Well, I can say on the health one might be one of the better examples here, where the kind of data that's employed is definitely accounting for a direct sort of effect or association of physical inactivity and chronic disease. So it has accounted for other contributors to, for instance, the prevalence of particular chronic disease. So I don't know if this is answering your question or not, but that would be the data that I would have the most confidence in speaking to, anyway, at least to answer that question. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. And this goes back to the point again where we're trying to use, based on the research evidence for the relationships between all these various indicators and then the various outcomes that we were looking at. We're looking for the strongest available data and evidence to support any of the decisions we've made.
I might just add to that too, like back to the question about visits or visitors. That's part of the rationale for why we went with visitors or users rather than overall visits, was to be able to better accentuate or differentiate between incremental and kind of impact that would have already been generated regardless of a project or departmental activity.
And in your calculator example, Mike, we're also looking at community level impact if in terms of that project and number of users we would argue would have more of an impact than one user swimming every day for the year, right? Yeah.
Okay, we're down to our last question, which comes from our friend Joe Doiron, who is a longtime contributor to the discussion about our sector. Regarding the economic indicators, is there any opportunity to explore links between the measuring impact work and public sector efforts related to the creation of well-being economies, including measuring what counts towards a quality of life framework for Canada at Finance Canada?
I'm guessing Joe's probably could probably answer that question for us, but yeah, I would, going back to my comment about the SDGs. I think that this is the way forward for us in being able to be more cohesive and coordinated in trying to address things that would fall in a broad public health and quality of life sort of sphere, is to be seeing where we do have overlap so that we can make a more concerted effort to address them. So I'd be all for it, Joe. But as I said, you might know better than we would even.
I think just something to add to that too is, there are other, like CPRA and CFLRI's work, and measuring impact isn't the only initiative out there that's trying to quantify or trying to explain impact. And that's fine. Like, it's great to have a whole bunch of that coming at a decision maker from different directions in different ways. We're trying to explain how we thought best to do it, and hopefully it resonates with you, and many of you can pick it up and use it. But there's also other other sources out there, and there'll definitely be more as we move forward that will come into play. Alignment with those other initiatives is important. Even throughout the course of our project, which was 12 to 18 months, I'd say there was 2 or 3 either reports or initiatives that surfaced that we didn't know about, that aren't exactly the same but are related. And it would have been great to have worked with those initiatives all along the way, but it just wasn't a reality. So a reality is there's going to be multiple sources or multiple stories being told, but all of them, I would say, as long as they're done in a credible and justifiable way, all of them are going to root back to that same source data. The same source data that we are pulling from is probably similar to what Finance Canada is pulling from. They may be manipulating it or changing it in a different way. But that source data is probably what's going to make sure that all of us are tied together. All of these storylines are tied together through the source data. And the more initiatives or groups or organizations that are pulling from it and asking, whoever is responsible for that source data about maybe doing a better job, maybe expanding it, maybe our better granularity or whatever, that'll just help us all tell a better story moving forward. So there's definitely alignment. I don't think anybody out there is not willing to partner or align, but the reality is, it's just hard to get everybody on the same page all the time. Not hard, it's impossible to have everybody on the same page all the time.
Okay, well, that's great. I think that concludes the Q&A portion. Just a couple of notes before we go. The first one is a mistake I made at the beginning. I meant to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Ottawa, which is the traditional homeland of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, who are the original inhabitants and custodians of this wonderful land on which I have the honor and privilege of living, working, and playing. I want to thank everybody for coming to the webinar. It's did a great job. We kept, we were close to 200 at the peak, and we kept 150 people right to this very moment. So thank you so much for coming. Merci à tous pour votre présence ici aujourd'hui. This recording will be made available on CPRA's YouTube channel. And just a few requests before you move on to the next part of your day. Number one is, visit measuringimpact.ca. There's a lot there, great tools and resources and infographics and the full report. So go there and share it with anyone who you think would benefit from being made aware of it. And as the presenters mentioned, we will be updating the data over the next period as well, and more tools and everything. So definitely go to measuring-impact.ca. Second thing is, as recreation parks professionals, you are really making an enormous contribution to the quality of life for people, who live in this great land. So thank you very much for that. Part of our mandate at CPRA is to create community nationally across our sector. So to that end, we encourage you to join CPRA Connect and start communicating with each other, sharing best practices. There's a QR code on the screen. If you click that, it'll take you right to the place. Sign up for it, it's free. And you get to continue this conversation and many others with your colleagues. And then the final pitch I will make on behalf of CPRA is, follow us on social media. Go to our website, sign up for our newsletter, and do not ever hesitate. If you have ideas or thoughts that you want to bring to our attention, write to us directly at info@cpra.ca. So we're going to end it there with a big thank you to our presenters, to our friends and colleagues at CFLRI, and to all of you for giving us, close to 90 minutes of your day. Thank you so much. Stay in touch, and more on this to follow. Bye.